Before introducing our distinguished guest, I'd like to thank the sponsors of our speaker series. They include Cravath, Swain & Moore, Davis Polk, DLA Piper, Fried Frank, Kirkland & Ellis, Latham & Watkins, Paul Weiss, Sullivan & Cromwell, Wachtell Lipton, Weil, and White & Case. I'd now like to introduce our guest. I'm thrilled to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Professor Anthony Appia. Professor Appia is one of our own. He teaches law and philosophy at NYU. Before NYU, he taught at Yale, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and Princeton. He has written widely in ethics, political philosophy, and African American studies. He's the author of really too many books to mention at this point, but they include The Ethics of Identity, Cosmopolitanism, The Honor Code, and most recently, The Lies That Bind. The Lies That Bind is the subject of today's discussion, and we have purchased a copy of that book for everyone in this room. It will be available on the tables outside as you depart, and Professor Appia has been kind enough to sign each and every one of them.
My hand is a bit sore.
In addition to Professor Appia's scholarly writing, he's written the weekly Ethicist column in the New York Times since October 2015. And among his numerous honors, he's received a National Humanities Medal from President Obama in 2012. Before we kick off the conversation, I'll just mention the process for audience Q&A, which we'll do at the end of the program. Instead of taking audience questions by microphone, we're going to do it by index card. So you should have an index card on your seat. Please write your questions on your cards as they come to mind during the discussion. Helpers will walk through the room to collect the cards, and I will read out a selection from the pile we get when we get to that portion of the program. With that, please welcome Professor Anthony Appia. So Anthony, let's begin with the title and what this book is about. So The Lies That Bind, what are we to make of this title and where does it come from?
Titles are always a struggle for books because you want to do something that's both likely to catch people's attention and also communicate what the book's about. So it's called The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity is the subtitle. And I batted a bunch of titles around, but this one seemed to be the right one because it's about the various ways in which social identities are both always involve misunderstanding, error, and intellectual confusion, but are nevertheless also central to holding people together and generating forms of solidarity, as well as all the bad things that no doubt we'll talk about that identity does. So I think there's a sort of simple-minded thought you might have, which is, if they're lies, how can they bind? You might have that thought. Well, the answer is that's what the book's about. You might have another thought, which is if they're lies, shouldn't we replace them with the truth? For various reasons, I think that while moving towards the truth is a good idea in general, it's not going to be possible to, as it were, purify them before we go on with them. We can't abandon them until they've been cleaned up. We have to go on with them as they are. So it was sort of stressing the ways in which these forms of identity involve philosophical confusions and other kinds of confusions, but nevertheless do important work.
Great. And you talk about this book as being a book about mistaken identities, but it's about mistakes we make about identities, not the idea that identity itself is a mistake.
No, identity, again, it's not an unnatural thought that if you see the damage done by patriarchy and sexism, or by racism and white supremacy, or by homophobia and heteronormativity, to think, maybe we should just try and do without these things. Maybe the alternative to bad identities is no identities at all. That's not my view. My view is the alternative to bad identities is better identities.
Great. So amend it, don't end it approach.
Yes, exactly.
And you take up, I mean, this is, you had me with, as those who know me will appreciate, with kind of fierce commitment to alliteration throughout this book. So the 5 identities you take up are creed, color, country, class, and culture. Right? So I think we can actually knock this out best by example. So let's begin with creed. You argue that religion is not primarily a matter of belief. Right? This goes against how a lot of people are accustomed to thinking about religion. So how do you think religion is organized, if not by belief?
As an identity. It's a form of identity. That's the main reason religion matters to everybody. Of course, each religion matters to its adherents for reasons specific to the way that religion is organized. But if you're thinking about religion in general, what matters about them is that they're forms of identity, and they're organized around, which means they're organized around ideas about how you should behave if you're a member of a certain religious group, how you should treat other people, maybe ideas in the society about how people of that religious group should be treated. So centrally, in other words, ideas about how you should behave and feel and so on. And in that, in some religious traditions, doctrinal questions may play a role. But if you actually look at and I should say, and perhaps this is not something I say in the book so as clearly as one might, it seems to me that a lot of the ways in which people talk about religion in the world today are based on the way in which the study of religion in the academy developed. And I think you can understand it best by saying that what happened was, in the sort of social sciences of religion, was that people asked about societies outside Europe, what do they have instead of Christianity? That was the question. So they don't have Christianity, what do they have instead? Well, the trouble is, that means that you'll sort of project out into the world a way of thinking about religious life that's actually specific to one of the world's great traditions. And in the history of Christianity, questions of creed and doctrine have been central. That's true. But that isn't true for it's not true for what we call Hinduism. It's not true for the traditional religions of Africa, and so on. It's not really true of Buddhism either. So, and if Confucianism is a religion, then I don't really care whether Confucianism should be called a religion or not, but if it is a religion, again, it's not something in which theological doctrine plays almost any important role. So I don't think we need to deny that there are religious traditions in which belief is one of the things people argue about. Though, and this is the thought that was a parenthesis back to the thought that I started with, which is that even if you look at the history of Christianity, it's striking how widely divergent interpretations have been of what Christianity as doctrine requires. And while Christians have fought each other and killed each other over the millennia over doctrinal questions, even within a tradition, people have often interpreted doctrine in different ways. So it can't be best to understand what's at the heart of the religious life of most people, I think, in terms of their commitments to sort of theological doctrine.
Great. So if that's the lie about creed, what is the lie that we have about country?
I think the easiest way to think about what the lie about countries is to say that what happened with the rise of nationalism in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then in the rest of the world, partly prompted by European empires, was the spreading of a picture of what a country was, what a nation was, which was this body of people who shared language, traditions, religion, culture, and because of that, needed a shared state to express the commonality that they already had. And the opposite is closer to the truth. Insofar as there are bodies of people who have shared culture, religion, language above a certain size, that's the result of the existence of states, not as it were the precondition of the existence of states. So in the late 19th century in France, a third of the population didn't speak French. It was the project of the French state to make everybody in France speak French. In the 19th century, I mean, we think of England as, and in fact we think of the British Isles as a domain in which everybody speaks English. But, well, again, not a story in the book, but when I went to university in England, at the age of 18, across the hall from me was another person who'd also grown up in England much of the time, and I couldn't understand a word he said, because he spoke Geordie, who was from Newcastle. Or Newcastle, as I said, but he said Newcastle. So the idea that, as it were, everybody in England could understand each other from the time of Shakespeare on, that's just false. So again, what happened in the 19th century? The development of a national dialect, which was then strengthened by the growth of radio in the 20th century, when a normative form of the British language was developed, which was BBC English. So I think, and of course, it's sort of obvious to someone like me who grew up in a place like Ghana. I'm older than Ghana. I was born before independence, but I grew up there, where there are 80. The government recognizes 80 languages. We have all these different political traditions. I grew up in the capital of a highly centralized state that had been in the part of an empire from the 18th century on, and was the heir to earlier empires in the region. But in the north of the country, there are people speaking their own language, 10,000 of them in so-called acephalous societies without much political organization, hunter-gatherers and so on, farmers, small farmers. Very, very diverse in terms of culture, traditions, language, and a lot of Muslims in the north, a lot of Christians in the south, a lot of not either Christians or Muslims everywhere, and so on. Matrilineal family systems, patrilineal family systems, if you want to go ethnographic. So very, very diverse. And yet Ghana is a place. And all these diverse people have been brought together to the extent that, and their language, their political language, English. That's the product of processes of state formation. There wasn't an Asante, there wasn't a Ghanaian nation there waiting to express itself through the Ghanaian state. And this idea, I mean, it's of Hegel's idea. Hegel's idea was that there were these things called, each person was a member of a folk, and history was about these folks getting organized as states. This is it's just empirically a misunderstanding of how the things we now call nations came to be.
Yeah, so you said acephalous. Yeah, so speaking of heads, you talk about the head of Medusa and the Medusa syndrome, right? My ears sort of perked up when I read about this because Antony talks about how when the state looks at you, it freezes your identity. So it takes things that are not fixed or rigid and imposes its own fixity and rigidity onto it. Very similar to the vein with which we started this conversation, though, you also say, this may be, faute de mieux, something that we have to do, right? And you use the example of Singapore. So could you talk a little bit about that, of how, Singapore looked out at its polity and essentially engaged in this form of nation building. But at the end, Singapore starts to look pretty good, right, in your account, yes, as something that, said, we are going to fix you into certain identities, but we're going to do it in a kind of intelligent and thoughtful way.
Yes. So just to say about the thing I said before, I'm in favor of Ghana, so I'm not against this process of to some extent, sort of creation of identities. I think it's necessary, and I mean the simplest reason it's necessary is because states have to be communities of strangers, and they have to do things together, and you need some kind of state-based identities in order for me to care about people in Alabama that I'll never know, I'll never see. I may even never go to Alabama, though I'm happy to accept invitations. I haven't been yet. But Singapore. So again, Singapore is a very young thing. It's the product of political processes in the mid-60s. It was supposed originally to be part of Malaysia, and for various reasons that didn't happen, so it ended up separate. It had populations who were identified by the colonial authorities as Chinese, Malay, Indian, and, of course, other. So C, M, I, and O were the sort of colonial categories. And what the sort of political genius who invented Singapore, the first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, realized was that he couldn't create a Singaporean identity by suppressing all of those, but he couldn't create a Singaporean identity that was based on any one of them, because if the majority were Chinese, you couldn't make the Chinese identity the official identity because the Malays and the Indians and the others would be upset. So what they did was they said, everybody gets one of these labels, and we will oblige you, and we will use English as our government language, but we will oblige every Chinese person, every person who has a C on their identity card, we will raise them speaking and writing Mandarin. We will raise the Indians writing and speaking Tamil, which was the majority language of the Indians of Singapore, who mostly came from South India, not from Hindu-speaking North India. And we'll take, and we'll have Malay for the Malays. And they will all learn their own languages and the national language, English, in schools. Now, you think it's obvious that you should pick Mandarin for the Chinese. 1% of the Chinese population of Singapore spoke Mandarin in 1965. Why did they pick Chinese? Mandarin Chinese? Well, because it was the language of China, not because it was the language of the Chinese of Singapore. This turned out to be a very good idea because, of course, the second great trading language of the world today is Chinese, and they were a small port and a major trading center. So, but the Prime Minister of Singapore himself, Lee Kuan Yew, didn't speak Chinese until he was 30, and he learned it in order to go along with this nation-building project. So Chineseness within Singapore was created by the Singaporean state. Lots of young, it's not so true now because time has passed, but 20 years ago, a lot of Chinese Singaporeans couldn't speak to their grandparents because their grandparents spoke Hokkien or some other Chinese, some other of the languages of China. Same with Tamil now. There's been lots of migration in from South Asia into Singapore, and many of the people who come in from elsewhere are not from Tamil-speaking areas, but Tamil is the official language of Indians in Singapore. So again, there are Indians in Singapore who can't speak to their grandparents because their grandparents don't speak Tamil, they speak some other Indian language. The Malays are more fortunate because they've been speaking, actually the Malays are not more fortunate because though many of them are speaking Malay all along, they've also been speaking another language whose name I'm blocking, which is not Malay. So again, in other words, the official languages of these ethnic groups of Singapore were chosen and then enforced, as it were, in a gentle way. I mean, just by making them the language of schools, not by beating anybody. And the result is they have a society in which everybody sort of has one of these things. They are also worked very hard to be multicultural, so they didn't, for example, most of the housing in Singapore is government created, and by law, the ratios between C, M, and I in these big housing developments have to correspond roughly to their ratios in the population. So in other words, there's forced residential integration. Again, most people don't mind it. It's not as if it doesn't feel oppressive, I think, to most people, but they thought a lot about what they were doing. So their way of handling diversity was to create some official forms of diversity, tidy them up a lot, and then also officially insist upon mutual respect and integration between the ethnicities. And you do not want, I mean, it's a serious criminal offense to engage in attempts to produce intergroup hostility in Singapore, either on the basis of ethnicity or race or on the basis of religion. And remember, just to complicate the picture more, the Chinese Malays, Singaporeans, are of course Protestant, Buddhist, Confucian. There's a significant proportion of the Malays are Muslim. Some of the Indians are Muslim. Many of the Muslims are Hindu. Catholicism, Anglicanism, and Protestantism are well represented. And one of the national monuments of Singapore is a synagogue. So they have great religious diversity. Again, you're allowed to be whatever you want in the domain of religion, but you're not allowed to criticize people of other religions. So Protestant missionaries from the United States who say bad things about Muslims and so on can get arrested and sent home.
And there's avid citizen. One thing that I didn't know and learned from your book is that there's avid citizen reporting.
Yes,
right,
no, citizens.
of intolerance, right?
Yes, if you do one of those things, the people will call the police and say, "I just heard this Protestant missionary stigmatizing Muslims," or "I've just heard this Muslim person suggesting that all Christians should be, whatever." So they do police themselves. So it's not exactly a liberal society because what it is a society in which, as far as I can tell, most people think that these arrangements are okay. However, they've been so successful that there's lots of interracial marriage between these groups. And the result, of course, is that if it says C on your mother's ID card and I on your father's, you have to decide which, you can't have both. So you have to decide whether your child will be raised speaking Mandarin or Tamil, as well as English, and so on. I mean, probably sensible people these days would pick Chinese because just for trade reasons. But anyway, so I think there's sort of generally, I didn't get the feeling, I've only been there a little bit, but I didn't get the feeling that lots of people were objecting to any of this. And yet it is a perfect instance of this Medusa syndrome because the form ethnicity now takes in Singapore is essentially the product of 50 years of government work.
Yeah. So I always get mixed up about whether the Medusa, I guess the basilisk kills us when it looks at us, and the Medusa kills us when we look at it. So they brought out the head at the right time, maybe is the right way to frame it. So moving on to race, in some ways the lies about race are, I think, most well understood in conventional wisdom. I don't know if you would agree with that, but it seems like this notion that there is a biological racial essence is something that, at least in progressive circles, we understand and we've debunked. So I want to use this topic in order to jump off a little bit to the idea of the 19th century, because this recurs like a through line. It was kind of a drumbeat throughout your book of prior to the 19th century, we just didn't think about racial identity in this way, you argue. And this chapter, you earlier said, France didn't think of itself as a nation state, and national identities didn't exist in the way we think of them today prior to the 19th century. The first line of your book is, until the middle of the 20th century, no one who was asked about a person's identity would have mentioned race, class, nationality, religion, or region, right? So first of all, what's going on temporally here in the 19th century? And then prior to that time, what would they have mentioned instead? How would prior generations of human beings have conceived of themselves in relationship to others?
So the new thought, of course, you just have to read, the Torah or the Iliad to see that people had lots of names for kinds of people from the very beginnings of historical times. That's not surprising. And of course, people distinguish between men and women, very, very notably. Again, in these classical texts, the big issue is the difference between men and women and so on. And people have been aware of the distinction between Christians and Muslims and Jews ever since there have been Muslims and ever since there have been Christians, and so on. The new thought is that the state you belong to, the religion you adhere to, and your gender are things of the same kind. That there are all these things called identities. So people knew that, people had all sorts of ways of categorizing people, and they behaved, similarly to the ways they do behave. But the thought that all of these are things of the same kind, so that you can have a general theory of identity, you can say these are all alike, that's actually a thought that you do not find. I looked. You don't find it in social theory before the Second World War, basically. That is, and in particular, you do not find it using the word identity. So there are ancestor ideas, but the word identity is first used for this thought that all these things are things of the same kind, which is now so routine that it doesn't even, as it were, count as a thought. It's just, well, of course. But that's because we all have acquired this concept.
And how do you think that happened? Right? Because in some ways, Anthony, it's as I'm just listening to you now, I think 1870 is a date that Foucault assigns to the creation of the gay person, yes. Right? Before that, same-sex sexual activity is just activity, and then the sodomite becomes a species, as he says, in this famously precise date of 1870, right? Yes. So is that a generalizable claim? Can we say that identities in general became implanted in us as kind of parallel tracks?
I think it's as I say, I think that the new thought is the thought that these are things of the same kind. Mm-hmm. So there are also new identities created, new kinds of identity as well. That's a separate topic. But so I don't mean to deny that people had what we call identities in the past, but they didn't think of them in the way we do, as it were a list of properties, right. of the central social properties, which were then going to be important both for you and for how others responded to you. Of course, everybody in Elizabethan England thought of themselves as men and women. Well, almost everybody. There's interesting kinds of people in Elizabethan England who are ancestors of some of our trans people today. But most people thought of themselves as men and women. It might not have occurred to them that because I was a man, I should do something or other. They might just have taken, as it were, what the masculine script was as just given. And similarly, of course, there were people in Elizabethan England who thought themselves as English. But the idea of the British nation as the thing you belong to and cared about, that's essentially the product of the early 19th century. And Linda Colley has argued it's essentially a product of the Napoleonic Wars, when Rule Britannia is written, and for the first time people think, it's a really important fact about me. And I think that, famously Benedict Anderson argued in his book on the nation, that one thing that's happening in the 19th century to the nation, and maybe this is connected with the rise of these other forms of identification, is that one thing that's going on is that more people are literate. Mm-hmm. And what are they reading? Well, the thing that everybody's reading is kind of broadsheets and newspapers. And what's in those? Stories about what we are doing, we Britons are doing. We are discovering Lake Victoria, we Britons. We are beating the Chinese in the Opium Wars. We are spreading Christianity in India and Africa. That sense of identification with the project, which you're not actually participating in, right? These people weren't missionaries, they weren't discoverers, they weren't explorers, but they were relating to the stories of those things as us doing those things. And I think a lot of 19th century nationalism is the coalescence of that thought, that we are doing something. And by the late 19th century, in France and Germany and Italy and England, the we is about the same shape as it is today. It's Italy or Germany or France or England, but one has to remember that Germany and Italy are late 19th century products. And before that, and so one of the interesting things that happens in the early 19th century in relation to German-speaking peoples is that they do have a German we, but it's not yet a state we, because there isn't a German state. There's the kind of memories of the empire, the German Empire, but the First Reich. But so I think in the 19th century these things are, I think it is connected with the rise of distributed literacy, the rise of large numbers of literate people. That people are sort of thinking, they're reading stories about us. Walter Scott, who's the most widely read British writer of the early 19th century, a lot of his stories are connected with ideas about nationhood. Both Scotland, which was where he's from, so the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border is a collection of Scottish poems, which is important to Scottish identity. But of course also a story like Ivanhoe is about the creation of Englishness out of Saxonness and Normanness in the past. So I think more people are reading. They're reading stories in which they identify with other people as fellow nationals in a way that I think people didn't very much in the 18th century in most places.
Great. Moving on to class, when people talk about correcting inequalities in wealth, power, opportunity, they often call for meritocracy. Yet the point you make in the book, in this chapter on class, is that the man who invented the term meritocracy, Michael Young, did so satirically and considered meritocracy to be dystopic. Really.
Yes.
So what did Young consider to be the dangers of meritocracy, and what should we put in its place?
So what he's writing in the 50s when he invents the word meritocracy in a book with the word meritocracy in the title. He anticipated, it's actually, if you read it, it's rather brilliant, because it's set in the future, looking back over changes in the class system in England, which are actually more or less the changes that actually happened after he wrote about them. So it's kind of interesting how prophetic it was. And the worry is this, that if you, so what's the idea of meritocracy? Well, you take, he uses the slogan IQ plus effort. You take, as it were, talent plus effort, and that's what you reward. And the result is you get a society in which everybody's entitled to what they've got, as opposed to the old form of class society, in which people get what their class gets. And so, upper class people get an upper class life independently of IQ and effort, and very talented and hardworking working class people still have a thing to bump up against. So, all right. So instead you say we do this with IQ and effort. What happens? Well, exactly what did happen. There was more social mobility. A new class develops. The character of the class develops. But two things happen. One is, and he anticipated both of them. One is that with the rise of gender equality, men and women who rise to the top end up getting together with each other. And so that increases the inequality, because in the old days, men who'd gotten up to the top by merit didn't insist on, roughly speaking, successful lawyers married secretaries. They didn't marry lawyers. Now they married each other, so that was one thing. But the other thing that he pointed out was inevitable. He said, look, even if you're doing this, you're creating forms of inequality that will mean that people have differential amounts of social and cultural capital. And what will they do with that? Well, of course, they'll use that to guarantee that their children enter into the privileges of the upper class. Even if they got there themselves by merit, they'll be working hard to turn their children into the kind of people who have the properties that will guarantee them success. So paradoxically, the result of all this is that you get to a situation where intergenerational transfers of social, financial, and cultural capital are become to look just like they did in the old ancien regime that you thought you'd gotten rid of when you got rid of the class society. So his thought was, what's wrong is not really how people get into different castes or classes. It's the very idea of organizing people in groups with kind of these structures of social status where people at the top get all the honor and the social rewards, not just the money, but they get all the honor. And people at the bottom are told, and he does this very well in the book, they're told, look, you have had every chance. We are a meritocracy. You're still at the bottom. That must be where you're supposed to be. And he thought that once you saw that the social rewards of money reflect only one dimension of people's capacities. They reflect their capacity to make an economic contribution, which is fine. But once you saw that people should be properly assessed in many, many dimensions, you wouldn't want a society which hoards all the respect for the people who are also hoarding all the money. So he favored he didn't really say how we could do it, and I don't think it's clear how we can do it, but we should be trying. He favored a social system which recognized many different, it was pluralistic in its forms of honor, but recognized many different kinds of excellence, including the kind of excellence that produces economic success in our kind of society. But he thought that we were, and that's exactly what's happened, I think. It's not exactly what's happened, but a lot of what's happened is we've gotten to this system where all the social rewards, not just money, are kind of piled into a small group at the top. And that group is able to use its very significant advantages in money and social and cultural capital to secure for its children succession into that status. And so you've got these things that look like castes. Now, that's a bit stronger than the data actually suggest. I mean, there is still inter-level mobility in our system, but much less than I think you would have predicted if you cared about the thing that the meritocrats cared about.
Yeah, I mean, there are actually at least two things that you're saying there, I think. I mean, one is the moral licensing point, right, where if we say, like, oh, this is a pure meritocracy, so devil take the hindmost, right? If you find yourself at the bottom, you've only yourself to blame. And there's a great study about organizations that say the organizations that believe they're the most meritocratic, in fact, are the most riven with bias, right? Because they've become complacent about all the forms of inequity that can arise, right? The other thing that you're saying.
So just to say, I mean, so I don't want to, I mean, and Young didn't want to suggest that that the forms of merit that our system recognizes are actually the ones that are announced as being. He understood that there was lots of prejudice and bias and so on in the system, and that it wasn't true that this so-called meritocracy was in fact operating by the advertised standards. That's also a problem. But his point was, even if it had, there'd be this problem that you'd be generating forms of hierarchy of status that are inessential. You don't have to have them, and they damage the people at the bottom, and they presuppose that there's only, as it were, one way of making a contribution.
Would this be cured if we level set every generation? So if we barred intergenerational transfers of wealth and honor? Or does the problem go deeper?
Well, I think you don't want, I mean, I know what Young would say. Young would say the solution is not to have single hierarchies. It's not to abandon the idea that some people are better at things than others. Right. It's to recognize that there are many things that people are good at, and that the people who are good at some of them are also bad at others, and the people who are bad at those might be good at something else. I do think that on the financial side, meritocracy, the official meritocratic theory doesn't explain why it is that we're allowed to transfer money, at least, to the next generation, because the official meritocratic theory is that we have these forms of differential rewards in order to incentivize things, and it's hard to see, so it's fine to incentivize you, but it's not clear why we should be allowing you to give your children a bump up, since that doesn't incentivize them.
Right.
Of course, somebody could say it incentivizes you, but and that is one of the main reasons people start accumulating money beyond a certain point. But so I think it's not clear why we should allow intergenerational transfers of wealth on the meritocratic theory. On the honor front, though, the problem is we don't know how to control transfers of that sort. Status and honor are very, very hard to interfere with through. I mean, we do it through social movements. I mean, so we've one of the things about say LGBTQ social movements over the course of my lifetime is that they've succeeded in removing dishonor from the status of homosexuals to some significant degree. So we can do it, but it's very hard, as we know in that case. So, and I think that the key thing is that you can stop the kind of hereditary transfers of honor that happen in an aristocracy. You can stop it being the case that just because I came out of the uterus of a duchess, I get high. But you can't stop the duchess getting me a tutor who gives me cultural capital that people who don't have tutors can't have. I mean, you can stop that, but imagine what that would involve in terms of interference in family life. So it's not just that you can do something to stop hereditary status transfers, but you can't stop people using the mechanisms of cultural and social capital. You know, we have these things. I think, what's his name, the French, Bourdieu, exaggerates the extent to which this is true, but it is true that there are things that people in the upper echelons of societies teach their children to do, which are just marks of distinction. Right. They have no function except to mark distinction. Knowing, used to be, if you were up for consideration for a fellowship at All Souls College, you had to demonstrate that you knew how to eat peas with a fork.
Right.
This is not a mark of intellectual distinction. It's not even very challenging. It's just a question of whether you happen to know how you're supposed to do it. And that sort of distinction can be used by people to do the in-out thing for their children, to keep their children in and other people out. So I think the key insight in the Young book is that people love their children.
Yeah.
And they'll do lots of things. If you give them any social mechanism for advancing their children over other people's children, they'll use it. And as I say in the book, nothing wrong with loving your children.
Right.
I don't mean to deny that. But we do need to organize society in such a way that people's love for their children doesn't allow them to gain for their children advantages over others to which they're not entitled.
Right. Yeah, such as photoshopping them into water polo photos.
Exactly. Yes.
Colleges,
Right.
yep.
I'm glad to say that's illegal.
Yeah. I can't resist saying, so a couple of things on this. I mean, one is he mentioned Michael Young, and one of the wonderful kind of expository gifts, of this book is that each chapter has a particular avatar figure who represents the identity in question. So we don't have time to sort of multiply examples here, but it's one of the things that makes the book so readable, because you're following along a person's story, and Michael Young's has a particularly ironic end, which I'll leave you to read. Okay, you at the end, and this is my last question, so please hand your questions in to our helpers who are wandering around, and we'll start taking them after this. The end of the book is really with culture. The last substantive chapter, I'll say there's a coda afterwards. And you're quite stern there. I mean, you take a turn towards being much more kind of prescriptive, and you say you want to give up the very idea of Western civilization altogether. So with all these other identities, you have a kind of mend it, don't end it attitude. Here, it's really just shut this thing down. So can you say a little bit more about why Western civilization is a lie and what we should replace it with?
Well, you could think it was a lie for the reason that Gandhi is supposed to have, he didn't actually say this, but is supposed to have thought it was a lie. I mean, he was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said it would be a very good idea. They would, if the West could get civilized. But no, the problem is this, that the idea of Western civilization, which again it's actually not even a 19th century invention. Our modern idea of Western civilization is essentially a post-First World War construction, and it was created for a perfectly honorable purpose, which was to reunite Europe after the astonishingly fierce and unpleasant divisions of the First World War. And the idea was to point back to these things that everybody had in common. So first, the things that are supposed to be the monuments of this tradition are all things which were substantially shaped by things that are officially outside the West. We get the so-called Western classical heritage back to us in part from the Arabs, who were the best Aristotelians during the European Dark Ages. So that's one problem. One problem is the things that we care about are not actually things that were only made by. Some of the most important recent discoveries of classical Greek text have come from looking in the libraries of Timbuktu, which turns out to have been once a place in which some classical texts, which didn't survive in Europe, survived, and everybody knows similar things happened with some of the libraries of Ireland. So, which is a very peripheral country in Europe, by the way. Sorry to the Irish descended people in the room. So that's one problem. One problem is that it's not Western. Second problem is that I think the story of Western civilization suggests that Aristotle, St. Thomas, and Elizabeth Anscombe are, as it were, important explanatory variables in explaining the history of Europe. And this is nonsense. But most of the history of Europe, most people in Europe had no idea about any of these people. Most of them couldn't read most of that time. It is true that classical philosophy, Platonism, and Aristotelianism were important for the development of Christian theology. But Christian theology wasn't important to most Christians because most Christians couldn't read and couldn't have understood it, and the debates were going on in Latin, which is a language that none of the people knew. So it's taking seriously as a kind of core of European history something that just cannot bear the weight, the explanatory weight. It's ascribing to Europe an essence that's this high-grade intellectual stuff, and that's just that's bad anthropology, it's bad history, and it gets things wrong. Finally, the idea of Western civilization was put together in part to celebrate good things, democracy, science, and so on.
Matthew Arnold.
And the trouble is that there are no democracies in Europe, essentially, before the 19th century. And arguably, there are none in the 19th century because women didn't get the vote anywhere. They didn't. In England and France and Germany and Italy, women didn't get the vote. The suffrage was anyway limited among men to people with property qualifications in many places. So if a democracy is a society in which you have shared responsibility among adults for the life of the society, so if democracy is part of the inheritance of the West, it's a funny kind of inheritance because it didn't exist in the West throughout the whole of this long history. It's true that the word democracy was coined in classical Athens, but it wasn't coined to describe what we mean by democracy because it excluded women and it admitted the existence of slaves. So, in the end, science, science as the core of the West, God, I mean, how many, just think about global warming and ask whether you think that there's something about being Western that makes you naturally inclined to believe the best science of your day about that. So again, I think, and the problem with that thought is that instead of seeing science and democracy as achievements which have to be struggled for, they're seen as inheritances that you're just guaranteed by stamping yourself with the Western stamp. So that's a bad, that gets in the way of science and democracy rather than advancing them. And if you claim science and democracy for the West, what are the people of Africa and Asia and everywhere else supposed to say about them? I mean, are they supposed to say, okay, good, democracy is Western, we don't have to bother with that. Science is Western, we don't have to bother with that. We'll do our own thing, thank you very much. What's good about science, it's not true that science was exclusively developed in the West, in Western Europe. But even if it had been, if there's anything good about it, it isn't because it was developed in the West, it's because it's full of good ideas.
Yeah.
And the good ideas should be shared widely around the world if they're good ideas. And if they're bad ideas, they shouldn't be used in Europe.
There's a funny resonance with the class chapter too, right? Because Michael Young would have probably disapproved of Western civilization if only on the grounds that you're inheriting it rather than working.
Yes, right. The idea that you've got to, the idea is, the things that people talk about under the rubric of Western civilization are many of them things that I love. But my Ghanaian father loved them too. My Ghanaian father had the Bible and Marcus Aurelius on his bedside table. Those were his 2 books. And if you wanted to talk to him about things, you ended up having to discuss what Cicero said about them because he was raised with a normal, high-class, imperial British education. And so he thought about things. One of the things he used to say about the city I grew up in, his city, the city where he was born, Kumasi, was, like Rome, he used to say, we are built on 7 hills. I mean, he imagined his own society through the Romans and the Greeks in exactly the way that lots of people around the world did, but not because he was Western. And he didn't admire Marcus Aurelius because Marcus Aurelius belonged to him as a Westerner. He admired Marcus Aurelius because Marcus Aurelius had some awfully good ideas, he thought. And I agree with him. Marcus Aurelius is one of the great cosmopolitans, for one thing.
We've got some great questions. So I'm going to bundle 2 of these together because they both have to do with gender and gender identity, which I think is an interesting decision in your book not to discuss gender. So if you could speak to that as well, that would be great. But here's one. Significant percentages of people today are rejecting binary gender categories since gender is such a powerful identity. What are the implications within your frame of thinking? Is this good, bad, or neutral? Right. And then the other is, in a similar vein, do you think our understanding of identity is becoming more fluid these days as our understanding of gender or gender identity is? Or are we just becoming more aware as a society of the lies of identity?
So just in defense of what I did in the book, the book started out as some lectures. In the lectures, I discussed a lot about gender in the religion chapter. I didn't talk about that here, but a lot of it was about showing that once you understood religion correctly, not in terms of doctrine, you could see that claims made about what religions, particular religious traditions, had to do about gender were just essentialist nonsense. That the argument that because it says somewhere in the Quran that women get a lesser share than men of the estates of dead men, that somehow Islam was eternally committed to gender inequality, that's just a way of thinking about the role of these texts in religious traditions that is not founded in what actually goes on. And in 1900, you would not have guessed that there would be women rabbis in Jewish tradition by the 1930s, and there were by 1930, by 1935. You would not have guessed that the Anglican Communion in the United States would have had its top bishop be a woman, because you wouldn't have thought that there would have been any Anglican priests, let alone bishops, if you look. So anyway, and the other thing is that in the first chapter, which is the sort of theory-laying chapter, I used gender as my main example because feminist philosophy has just done so much to give us the tools for thinking about identity, and it seemed to me that gender was the right paradigm topic. So now, to answer the questions, I think that it's sort of one of the arguments of the book is that it's not up to me to decide what's going to happen in these domains, or you, or the questioner. We are going to have to figure it all out together. And we together are going to have to, and what we're going to figure out in the domain of gender is going to have to depend on trying to reshape it in ways that fit for everybody. It has to work for everybody. Gender did not work for everybody as it was configured when I was a child. We've done a lot of work, and it's been reconfigured in ways that mean that it sits more lightly on more people, and that's great. But the non-binary people and trans people are making us see that it isn't configured adequately yet for everybody. But it has to work for everybody. We can't, as it were, just make it work perfectly for trans people, but leave everybody else uncertain about how to think about their gender or what to do with their gender. It has to work for all of us. So I'm mostly in favor of the changes that are going on because they're in response to claims made by people who say it's not working for me and I'd like these changes. And since the changes they're asking for don't make my gender not work for me, I don't see how I could possibly reasonably object to that. People make up things, and maybe people genuinely feel that threatened by, by bathrooms where different classes of people from the past are allowed to enter. I think that's just a matter of getting used to things. It won't take most people very long. And if it does take somebody a long time, it'll be because they're rigidly holding out for the old ways. Another sort of set of arguments in the book or suggestions in the book is in relation to the second question, that it is important, I think, that one of the things that's going on, that now that we see that these identities are things we make together, we can also see that they don't need to be so heavily policed and imposed upon everybody, though, as I said, I don't think that means we need to give them up altogether. We don't need to have... So that means you can't have no policing because it's only the fact that there are things you can't do with an identity that gives it a content. Mm-hmm. The constraints, it's a familiar thought for lawyers, that constraints are what liberate us in the end, that we need to have structures within which to make our lives. But they need to be structures that work for everybody, and they will never work for absolutely everybody. So a little bit of flexibility in all of them increases the probability that for the people who, for one reason or another, something isn't working, will be able at least to find a decent place in the system. If you make the system rigid and inflexible and police it heavily, then the people who don't fit into it will be oppressed.
What about, and this goes to a question about human nature that I want to make kind of part of this conversation. So it says, in discussing meritocracies and possible alternatives, a major problem is that humans naturally fall into hierarchies, and they seem to organize our societies based on the passing of capital to children. So are you not fighting basic human nature? So you've talked about sort of enabling constraints, right? But we might also think about, the constraints of, say, wanting to favor my own children. I actually think there's a lot of social science about the human desire to classify and to essentialize, right? So you would say against essentialism, but isn't it just human nature to essentialize?
Yes.
So how do we deal with these sort of brute facts of what we might call human nature, even if we evacuate that of any kind of biological content? What do we do with these tendencies that we see repeatedly expressing themselves?
Well, so, and the first chapter on the classification chapter, I do talk about some of that social science and about the ways in which children, pretty much unprompted, will generate essentializing categories of people. They need some input, but whatever input you give them, they're going to essentialize something. And so one thing is to know that and to think about how, since the essentialization usually involves error, we can, as we grow, come to recognize the errors that we spontaneously fall into and try to avoid them. In terms of hierarchy, yes, again, as the author of a book on honor, which defended the idea of honor, I'm not against hierarchies, but I think that hierarchies have to meet two conditions if they're not to be very bad for society. One is that they have to be diverse. That is to say, there have to be hierarchies organized around different values. If you organize all the hierarchies together into one system, it just means that there are people who every day are going to be thinking, I'm at the bottom of this, and I'm at the bottom of that, and I'm at the bottom of that, and other people who are going to be wandering around saying, I'm at the top of this, and I'm at the top of that, and I'm at the other. And that might be okay for the people who are saying they're at the top, but it's horrible for most people who are not going to be at the top or anywhere near it. So I think we need a diversity of hierarchies. Also, I think we should wear them with the lightness more lightly, and just as we should perhaps wear our identities more lightly. We should. It's great to be a terrific basketball player, but it's not. You know, there are other things that are great, and basketball isn't the most important human activity, and so on. And the same's true of novels. Novels are wonderful. It's great to be a great novelist, but novels aren't the most important thing humans do. So, calm down. So I think we I'm not against, and the second point about the sort of conceptual point is, hierarchies need to be organized around values we can endorse. And the question whether having the good fortune to be someone who happens to have developed skills that are highly financially rewarded in your society is the sort of thing that we should organize hierarchies of respect around is a question we ought to discuss. You're already getting lots more money than everybody else in that system. It's not clear to me that we owe you honor as well. So I think we need to think about, I think we over-honor wealth. I think we over-honor celebrity in the movies. We over-honor sports celebrity, I think. But these are topics we can talk about. I mean, we should have conversations about. So we got to be organizing hierarchies around the right things, and we got to have lots of hierarchies. And none of the hierarchies should be organized in such a way as to impose upon the people at the bottom of them conditions under which they can't maintain their self-respect. So we need to maintain the Rawlsian ideal of a society that guarantees the social bases of self-respect to everybody, and any forms of hierarchy that don't allow for that need to be combated.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to close after saying this. We have several questions, which I encourage you to, I'll give to Antony, and you should feel free to speak to him afterwards, about how to solve particular practical problems in our polity, right, in an age of huge nationalism. I got a question about what would you advise we do about Brexit? How does this book, help solve Brexit? I've actually steered clear, of those questions in preparing my own remarks, because I think in some ways it diminishes, in my mind, the real accomplishment of the book. But I do think that the book goes, which is timeless and not bound to any particular controversy. But I'd like to end by reading the quote at the end of the book, because I think, Antony, if I were to sum up, your Irv, I don't think it can be summed up, but if I were put to that task, I would say this kind of relax about your identities, of lower the temperature on these different identities that you hold, and try to raise the salience of our common humanity, right? I take to be one of the through lines from, Cosmopolitan, really from the ethics of identity to this book. And so the last line, really penultimate line rather, of the book is from the dramatist Terence, where he says, "I am human, I think nothing human alien to me." And the last line of the book is, "Now there's an identity that should bind us all." So I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Appiah.
Thank you very much.